Hi, I'm Chris Coburn, and I wanted to thank you all for coming to this fifth and final Innovators Symposium in this series. We expected this one to be the best attended, and you all didn't disappoint. I know others will be coming in during the course of the program. We want to recognize a set of folks who are here, including some of the leadership of the hospital. Thank you all. When most people think about venture capital, they in many ways, they think it's all about the money. And we hope when you leave here tonight, you'll share our opinion that it's really the people that matter the most in the equation. Having just a few minutes ago left a tribute for Henry Termeer, I'm reminded of the importance of expertise, vision, and resilience into making a successful venture from an idea and from an investment. That notion of high-quality people extends to our entire team, and many of them here tonight. I want to acknowledge our hardworking staff, in my mind, the hardest working folks in investment and commercialization in the academic realm. I also want to acknowledge, especially tonight, the members of the Partners Innovation Fund. Unable to be here, Carl Burke, one of the original partners in the fund, came to Partners after a career at Polaris in the investment world and in consulting. Also, I think not here is Jay Knowles. Jay, very successful entrepreneur, a member of the deal-making team at Novartis, and brings his investment background. In a little bit, I'll have a chance to introduce Meredith Fisher, who is moderating the second panel. But I just want to acknowledge the great work of our investment team, and just as one measure of success, the internal rate of return is often cited for venture funds as the sine qua non as a metric of performance. If you were to look at the Partners Innovation Fund through that lens, they rank at the top quartile in the entire industry. Usually academic funds are found at the other end of the spectrum. So to do that in an academic setting, from our standpoint, is a really magnificent achievement. The net IRR, kind of apples to apples, is almost 20%. And I'm sure any limited partner would be thrilled to be in a venture fund with those numbers. I also want to acknowledge two other members of the Innovation Fund team, Robert Millman, who's joined earlier this year as an entrepreneur in residence, bringing his immense deal sheet of successes and returns for investors, and Tracy Brenner, who's another key member of the team who's helped very much to secure outside support. So then that brings me to Roger Kitterman, who leads the venture fund and has led it for virtually its entire existence. A lot of people don't know. I think everyone knows Roger's been in the investment community most of his career. A lot of folks probably don't know. At a very early age, he was part of a team that returned 8 digits to the Bulgarian government on a high concept venture fund that was started to help drive some economic renewal, and those returns are still benefiting the people of Sofia and elsewhere in the country. So, and then I want to conclude this introduction by acknowledging Amir Nishat, one of the great friends of the hospital and all of our efforts. Remarkably, he serves on 3 different advisory panels for us. I think his managing partner, Terry McGuire, is getting other value from him, but we certainly are. So we're very grateful. So this first session, Roger will tee it up. But in our view, this is kind of an in-depth discussion about the philosophy and approach, and again, why the people and the processes matter, really, in a sense, more than the money. And then after we have this fireside, we'll look for some audience interaction, then we'll transition to the panel, and then finally we'll wrap up with a reception. So we hope all of you can stay, and we intend to answer as many questions as possible tonight, either during the session or afterwards. So Roger Kitterman and Dr. Amir Nishat.
Thanks. So as Chris mentioned, Amir is a partner at Polaris Ventures, where he's been since 2002, focusing on healthcare investments. Background, Amir got his PhD in chemical engineering at MIT, studying with Bob Langer, and then has degrees from the University of California, Berkeley as well, a couple of those. He's been on the Forbes Midas list of the 100 top venture capitalists in the country. And most importantly, he's been a member of our investment committee for the Partners Innovation Fund for the last almost 10 years now, and really been incredibly helpful guiding us and helping us think through investments and those kinds of things. So, maybe I'll stop there and maybe let you introduce Polaris and a little bit what a Polaris is.
I should, in full disclosure, say that I was in the high 90s on that list of 100. So, so Polaris, we're a venture capital firm, and we invest in a lot of biotech companies and medical companies over the years. We love to, kind of work with academics, and have been one of the groups here in Boston for the last 25 years or so, both at Polaris and my partners before they came to Polaris at their predecessor firm, who'd spun out technologies from universities. I was referencing outside, just saying to Chris and Roger, one of my partners, can you guys hear me okay, or it's hard to tell? Okay. One of my partners had invested in a company years and years ago, which went on to create Cubicin, which then it went on to kind of like actually save my dad over the holidays. And it's kind of strange. It's actually an amazing thing how important the work we do is. If you really take a step back, it's fun to invent stuff, but when you can make a difference in people's lives when they're desperate and sick and scared, that's a whole different kind of just level of karma, kind of benefit, legacy. And you just put it all, whatever, way you cut that, it's powerful stuff. And Chris and I were just at the tribute to Henry Tremere, and it kind of comes across so strong to us that we're doing something really special. And society's kind of given us a pretty amazing sandbox to play in. Society's letting us create these medicines for them and help them, and it's really great. And so at Polaris, by and large, we're kind of pretty addicted to that. And on the healthcare side, also on the tech side, we invest in healthcare IT companies, actually providers. So there's a company out of MGH called Iora. Some of you may or may not know Rishika. He came to us with an idea to help people with, basically on Medicaid, get concierge medicine in a way that's sustainable, makes money, which, I couldn't even put, I thought 1 + 1 = like -6 when he first described the idea to me. But when you go through and you understand what he's trying to do and the way he thinks about populations and grouping of people and risk, it makes sense. And so now we're up to, I think, 15 or so facilities. And again, we're backing an entrepreneur that wants to create better medicine for the poorest and sickest Americans. How could you say no to that? And so I think that's kind of what we do at Polaris, is mostly just try to follow great entrepreneurs and provide them capital and advice, but let them kind of go on and start these companies. And we've been doing that a long time, and I think we'll keep doing that until they take our money away from us, I guess.
That's great. And so sort of following up on that, and maybe trying to step back a little bit, and for somebody here who might be across the table from a venture capitalist, talking about how to pitch them, what gets you excited about a deal? When you're hearing something, when you're in a meeting with someone, what really engages you to say, okay, this is something that I really need to follow up on? What are some of the attributes that really differentiate some of the ones that, like, wow, this is something, versus you see a lot of deals and you can't follow up on all of them?
Sure. So I'm going to give a generalized answer first, so it's going to sound like I'm not answering your question, but it's relevant to the process. You all are trying to learn how to get money from venture capitalists and create your companies. And just like granting agencies, the way the NIH gives, says yes to something is totally different than the way a different granting agency does. Every VC firm, and actually almost every partner you're across from, is actually quite different in what they say yes to. And it's taken me some time to figure this out, but basically people say yes for emotional reasons. They say no for logical reasons. So whenever you come back and, I have my CEOs, they do this, they come back and they give me all these 8 reasons, like very logical reasons why they heard no. The answer to that is they didn't understand the emotional logic of the person across the table. And so there are kind of buckets of reasons why people say yes to things. I'll answer first for myself, which is I tend to like an idea that sounds crazy when I first hear it. And it almost sounds like wrong. Like, for example, we're going to do concierge medicine for poor people. Like, that makes no sense. It makes no math. It just makes no financial sense. But the person across the table is smart. They know what they're talking about. They're not wasting their time, and they're competent. And so I want to know more. Like, I kind of am curious why I'm wrong, and let me dig into that. So we had a company that came. One of my favorite investments was my partner brought that one also. Was a company that showed up that told us they could help patients quit smoking by telephone calls, just through behavior management on the phone. Which, to me, my first reaction was like, no way, that's like impossible. I mean, it's just, this guy must be lying. It turns out they had like 1,000 to 2,000, maybe even more actually, patients worth of data where they had shown it successfully. 41% quit rates 12 months after the program ended. Cold turkey's 3%, Chantix is 21%, but it has a 5% compliance rate. This is 41%, counting in compliance and everything. And so everybody in the room is probably thinking what I'm thinking is like, well, how are they doing that? And so that's kind of my moment, is like, I'm like, wow, that's an intriguing, it's like a great problem, and it makes no sense. So I get curious, and that's kind of how you and me over. Other venture for, you can kind of bucket us. I would say there's a group of people that like hot, shiny, like cool things, right? And if you look at their investment record, they like that, they like gene editing. They liked RNAi when it first came out. They kind of like those things that are on the bleeding edge. There are groups that actually like things that everybody else likes. And so, I guess if, you're doing immuno-oncology right now, that's the group you want to talk to. There's groups that like deals that are kind of going like really, really fast, and they can't get in. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. We're all different in how we make decisions. And what you want to do is understand the person across the table. The problem with that is it's very hard to do that unless you've actually, like, I can tell you pretty quickly how me and my partners, by the way, within Polaris, we actually make decisions differently. My 5 or 6 partners, we all have slightly different reasons we do things, and say yes to things. So it's very hard to know that if you've met us for the first time. That's why I think having either experienced entrepreneurs who have met us and been through lots of high end with us, or know how to look through our portfolios and figure out kind of roughly what you kind of see from that. And I think that's where PIF steps in, where they're dealing with us on a very, very daily basis. So we all know how to write grants for NIH because we're probably submitting hundreds of them in any big lab over the course of a decade, getting mostly rejections and some yeses. And that's what I'm doing all the time with other VCs because I'm pitching them my companies. Roger's doing that. And so it kind of helps to have a little bit of inside baseball. But I would say the main thing is to understand what makes the person across the table tick and what do they like to see. So my answer was specific to me, but actually Roger's question is almost a perfect question when you start a conversation, because if you can't figure that out, it's very hard to make the next 55 minutes work, right? Because you don't really know what to say or what to do, because you don't know what the customer wants, in a sense.
And as you think about, you're looking at an opportunity, you're meeting with someone, and you're evaluating the people that you're meeting with, and you're evaluating the technology that they're bringing. Talk a little bit about how you weigh that in your mind, the importance of one versus the other. Just a little bit about what the calculus is there.
Sure, I think again, it goes a little bit to. I think in general for early stage technology, if you really look at what no matter whichever bucket you fell in my previous answer, the common thread in all that is that entrepreneurs are really need to be passionate and really care about what they're trying to do. And I think the articulation of why they're doing what they're doing and this stubbornness around why they're doing what they're doing is really important. And because now there needs to be a stubbornness around the end goal, right? If there's stubbornness about the path you take, that becomes a little tricky because paths are going to change. You're going to find out that this pathway didn't work, that it didn't work so well in fibrosis, but it might work in, asthma and blah, blah, blah. And so, things are going to change as you get going. But the stubbornness about the outcome, the purpose of why you're doing what you're doing, I think has to come through clearly. And I think everything else is second to that. If you don't have that stubbornness about this is really important, it's going to save a lot of lives, I think that, in a sense, investors get a little turned off by that. I would say early stage investors, because we know all the other stuff's going to get all the cynicism of raising money in markets and IP and all this other stuff's going to weigh you down. So you need to have that core fire burn hot to burn through all that, because everything else is conspiring to kind of cool down this great idea. So that idea's got to be really hot. So I think it's the passion, I would say. I mean, I would say every time we've ever invested anything, that's been the main thing that's come through, is the intensity of the idea.
Right. And, so Polaris works a lot with very early stage ideas, raw academic startups. When people are coming to us, oftentimes they'll say, well, don't I need to hire a CEO before I go pitch the venture capitalists? So maybe talk a little bit about, when you say team, there's the team on the day that you're introduced to the idea, and there's the team at the end of the day that is actually running the company. And what do you like to see as far as how fully formed and gelled the team is before somebody should come talk to you?
Sure. And if you noticed in my previous answer, I didn't talk about like markets or market size or any of that. And part of it is the audience, right? I mean, if I was, I guess if I was speaking to a series of experienced entrepreneurs, I might or business guys, I'd probably say something different. But we invest in early stage technology. We're backing technologists, scientists, doctors, et cetera. We're not asking people to be business people. That's not, because we know that that's not what that's not your job, right? You're in a sense, your passion is around the science, the technology, and the patient unmet need, and finding a new solution to do something special for people. And so I think that it's okay actually to not have that other stuff in place. But I think the trick is to be very clear that we don't have that other stuff in place. And one of the mistakes we see over and over again is that people come to us a little too early, but are trying to, pretend or, say that, oh yeah, the market's going to be this big and the total available market and, pricing or whatever. And part of it is it's fine if you really know those numbers and you're business oriented and somehow have that figured out. But if you don't know it, don't worry about it. I mean, we, at a Polaris, we have enough instincts around the idea, and the disruption is big enough. We'll layer all that other stuff on there. But I think that it's much worse to bring in. And then the other big mistake people make is, in an attempt to not answer those questions and have someone else answer it, to go and find a terrible person to come and answer those questions. And I think that's like even worse than not answering or trying to answer it yourself. Because when you get stuck with a wrong team, it's really hard to unwind bad co-founders, bad CEO, CEOs, but yeah, bad. And you see this constantly all over the academic entrepreneurial landscape. And I think that's, again, the other thing I've watched. If I really look at, I've had the pleasure of watching PIF, do well. And as Chris pointed out, post probably the top returns in this area in healthcare, pretty much of any venture firm I've seen. It's the ability to, because of the work they do before the investment ever becomes an investment. So, the deals we look at the investment committee level already have management that's been curated by Roger and Carl. They have people they're constantly talking to, entrepreneurs in residence like Robert and others, who they have curated as being pretty good at business, at successful entrepreneurs, people that can work with scientists, et cetera. So you already have that in place, and you have that roster of folks. So when the great idea gets matched with that, the match has to be pretty specific. I mean, not every business entrepreneur will latch on and do well with every scientific entrepreneur. You're kind of trying to find people to match, and so I think that's what PIF does really well. It's what we'll try to do if an idea comes to us raw, like Bob Langer calls, and it's a raw idea. We'll meet the postdoc, and we'll try to think who's the business person that would go well with this idea. So I think the CEO is not important, actually. And if anything, a bad CEO is like I mean, we're like, it's even worse. And then it's hard to unwind it because I, across the table, wish I had been able to talk to the person 6 months ago and said, don't do that. There's somebody, that person's perfect for a different kind of company or whatnot. But it's too late. You feel bad. You don't want to tell them, oh, your co-founder, and you don't know kind of what to say. And so as a consequence, you just politely say no and you walk out of, and so then you have a wasted opportunity.
And, one of the other issues that I think people run into is they make an assumption that a venture fund is a venture fund is a venture fund from a life science perspective. And maybe talk a little bit about, like, not every deal is a Polaris deal that's a good deal. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about to say, okay, what is the kind of deal, beyond what you've already said, that really feels like a Polaris deal versus here's some other things. There are good venture deals that there are great venture funds that might invest in those, but it's just not what Polaris does. And a little bit how people should think about how they approach different firms.
Yeah, and actually, I think that's a really important point and an important service that friends of yours in the community that either had to raise money, have raised money, or investors, or like PIF specialize in this as well. That's the other piece of great advice. It's related to the first point, which is every partner makes decisions differently, and then every venture firm likes things a little different. And so if I were to say, like, let me describe Polaris as like what we tend to like. And again, every rule will have its exceptions, and that's fine. But in general, the rules, help you out a lot. And so at Polaris, we tend to like an idea that is very broad conceptually, but very simple. Kind of a simple, broad idea, I guess was what I would say, that has a reasonably large number of potential embodiments. So that's what we call platforms of products or platform technologies. So RNA interference is a really good example. It's a very simple idea when you first hear it. There's these little, 21 to 23 mers, and they silence, transcripts right at the moment. And so it's easy to understand. And then the other thing that's interesting about it is that, again, this is specific to Polaris. It came at a time where nucleic acids were really out of favor. And so, we can kind of like things that are a little contrarian or against the dogma and are very simple and elegant solutions to that. And the reason I say that is people today look at Alnylam and they kind of forget, they think, oh my God, that stuff is like, it's fantastic. But when Alnylam was founded, it was very contrarian. Nucleic acids had gotten really beat up really badly, actually. Antisense was pretty much completely gone. The antisense company, ISIS, had struggled for a long time. There were a number of ribozyme-like companies that had gone bankrupt, et cetera. So, you're trying to start something at a moment where everyone in the previous decade has lost money. But the solution was really elegant. And there's a reason why we thought 21 to 23 mers would work, because they were catalytic. And so you didn't need to give a lot of the molecule. You could put a little bit in, and it could treat many different kinds of disease. So there were many embodiments of it. So if you look at the Polaris investments, they almost all have that kind of, we kind of invested in it at a time where everybody thought it was a dumb idea, but there's an elegant simplicity to why the thing works, and you can use it for many different applications. So if I switch gears, and then our approach tends to be to build companies. We prefer to have big companies that last versus selling our companies off. I mean, if you gave us the choice, we would always try to build a company to keep growing because we think there's just more value for us and for society. I'll give you a very, very simple example of that. At the same time that we started Alnylam, there was another antisense company. There was actually a ribozyme company that got repurposed into an RNAi company. It was called Cerna. It was renamed Cerna. And Cerna got bought by Merck, huge exit. Everybody loved it, blah, blah. Alnylam went public. And then if you look even, today or even 5 years ago or whatever, all of Merck's efforts in RNAi had been shut down. Cerna basically was shut down, but Alnylam kept plugging away. And they did that for exactly one reason. They had nothing else to do. And so whereas at Merck, they got other things they can do. So if it's within a budget, it's within a set of priorities. Peter Kim's no longer the president. New guy comes in, needs to make his mark, picks a few things to kill. I mean, just all kinds of stuff goes crazy when you're in these big companies. John Margano had no choice but to succeed. So when his company was trading at $500 million market cap and at $350 million of cash, he had to make it bigger. I mean, you remember him today being multi-billion dollars, but I mean, he went through, in the same week, he'd get punched twice in the face. And so with news flow and things. And so the poor guy and his whole team had to survive that. That's entrepreneurism. And at the end of it is huge benefit, right? Much, much bigger. It's always kind of tricky to do that when you're in a big company. So, but I don't know if there's any questions. We should be asking more questions and sending people.
So we're going to have questions in a minute. And Amir and I have agreed on some ground rules here. So we've put our email addresses up. And nobody needs to pitch anything right now or at the reception afterwards and grab and say, I've got something, you got to talk to me. We've both agreed that anybody in the room who emails us will get a thoughtful and considered response from us, and we'll go from there. So that don't feel like this is if you don't talk now, you don't have a chance to pitch something to Innovation Fund or to Polaris. So there's the email addresses there. I have one quick question for you before we go to other people's questions, which is, Polaris used to do device deals. And the device industry from a VC perspective has been really poor for a long time. Do you see that changing ever?
Yeah, I mean, and obviously there's a lot of entrepreneurs in the audience that develop devices. I think at the heart of it, it's a little bit like energy too. The ecosystem in the device world is a little broken, and it's broken for a number of reasons. And it's one thing to invest in technology, but that technology then has to get to the market, and it has to be successful in the market. And that whole path, except for certain places, is tough in the device world. All the big players are consolidated, so you only have a couple of companies, and they're so focused on being profitable and they're run by financiers. They're not run by engineers or doctors anymore. And the FDA is just rough on you as a medical device entrepreneur. So what happened to us is we invested in a number of medical devices, which are doing great. We ended up helping people and having good financial returns, and then we ended up helping people and having terrible financial returns, because what would happen is the device would work, and the big companies wouldn't acquire it. And they would tell you, well, once you get profitable, once you get reimbursement, once you get profit, and they just they kept moving the goalpost. And at some point, you get kind of pissed off about it. And I think I don't think it's a thing for a single venture capital firm or the venture capital industry to fix. I actually think it's something that we need to figure out as an ecosystem discussion is how do you create new models where young entrepreneurs or medical device entrepreneurs start young companies, create something really interesting, make a bunch of money, and do not sell it to the big guys, so the big guys realize that if they don't jump on stuff early, they're going to lose out, and that's when they'll start to fund the early stuff again. So it's a complicated question, but that's why we got out of it, because it's too tough. Like, we're kind of wimpy.
So we'd love to take some questions from the audience. I think Rich has a microphone if anybody has any questions, and if people don't have questions, I'll just start calling on people.
Yeah.
How does some of your advice change when the IP has gotten mired down and needs a new start?
I'm so I have this kind of personal belief, and it goes against what everyone will tell you, and I'm sure I'll even disagree with myself a lot. But I do believe this, that if you actually create something new that helps people, IP kind of in a weird way, don't cover your ears, Chris, but it matters, and it makes life a lot easier. But it's really incumbent on us to figure out that an IP decision is not the problem, right? And so I'll give you an example. Let's say you're an innovator and you found a new use for someone else's drug, and they block you, like they full on block you, and you'd never be able to sell that drug, right? I'd say, okay, you're stuck. There's nowhere to go. But I'd challenge people to show me a court in this land that would injunct a company that had a drug that they launched that helped, let's say, kids, or that actually saved someone's life or really changed standard of care, that did not have somebody else would block you. What the court will do is we'll say, look, we're not going to injunct you guys. We're not going to stop you from getting on the market. What we're going to do is force you to pay these guys a royalty rate. And I'm sure at the end of the day, what they're going to figure out is that royalty rate is about the same royalty rate you get to if you went through a huge argument over negotiations. And so the bottom line is, like, IP is important, and it's important for the little company to protect itself against the big company. But if you have a great innovation, we should be able to, as a society, figure out how to get rewarded, how to bring that to patients and not make that the reason why it doesn't get fixed. So people go through all kinds of, like formulations, and we're going to do that. But I think a discussion, Partners is a good example. Partners Healthcare is, has got an insurance arm. Why not talk to those guys about, look, if we have an innovation that's really cheap because it doesn't have patent protection, how do we turn it into a disease management company, right? Where we'll take risk with you on the patients, we'll get it out there, and we'll figure out a way to get paid together or whatever. I just think that the system should be smarter than what VCs always say, including me, which is, if you don't have great composition of matter IP, we're never going to do it. That's what the pharma guys always say. So it depends on your specifics. It's not a generalized, I can't generally answer it, but I just feel like that's not a reason to quit. It's a reason to think a little harder and maybe get a little creative and do things that no one's ever done before. But it's not, I don't know that it'd be a reason to quit necessarily. But you should still get the best patents you can, because it makes it a lot easier. It makes it a lot easier if you don't have to do that. But
Amir, often I'm in the innovation office, and often people say we're going to get a meeting with the VCs and they want you to put a deck together. Would you mind, for the audience, kind of saying what are the top 5 things you'd like to, 3 to 5 things you'd like to see in a deck?
So to me, you're telling a story, right? It is going to sound strange, but I think you just go with a Shakespeare route, right? If you're trying to tell a happy story, you start happy, you get sad, you end happy. If you're trying to tell a sad story, start sad, make it happy, halfway through, and then kill everybody at the end. And then, so you're trying to tell a comedy, obviously, because you're trying to raise money. And so I think, you got to start with, and my partner Terry has this great saying, which scientists don't. So I'm going to give you 2 things which are like against the whole, everything I learned in 15 years of working in benches and all that kind of stuff. Is number 1, you tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them again what you told them. So the power of simple repetition is so important when you're dealing with investors, and when you actually, ironically, especially when you don't have a lot of time. You need to make those points really pithy, but you need to kind of hammer them, right? And then if you look at how are usually, like papers I always wrote, you start with a big intro section, and then you got a big materials and methods section, and then you got a big results section, and you don't get to the heart of the thing until the very end. So I think you got to give the punchline early. Like, you got to tell people what the answer is to the question, and then explain why the question's important, and explain why everyone else has kind of, stubbed their toe. So to me, you tell them, we've got a way to image, cancer or tumors before anyone else, whatever it is. You can tell them the happy news, and then you tell them why it's been so hard. Like, everyone else has said this too. Ralph is here, so everyone said this for years and years. We're gonna do it, but Ralph would say this is a really hard problem, but there's a reason why we solved it, and it's very specific actually. And we didn't think we could solve it, or we've been working on this for some number of years, or it's a total surprise to me, but we solved it. And here's the implications of us solving it. So I think that storyline, tell us why the problem is so important and what's going to happen if you fix it. But then tell us why it's so hard, right? I think, if it were me, those 3 concepts in a deck, the markets and all that stuff, I would put that stuff in only in the following sense. If you're dealing with a market that I don't think is a big market, then you should in the deck. What I would do is I would tell your idea to a few people, or even yourself maybe, and whatever the top 3 concerns are, put those in the deck. So I'm sure you think this is a tiny little market. That's what I thought. But let me tell you why it's not. Or I know you think that there's no way to get patents on this, but tell you what, we got them. It is interesting. I think you're gonna. I remember I had one company I started with a guy named Elazar Edelman at the Brigham. Which I guess I'm not supposed to say around here, maybe. So I'm really sorry, but anyway, he's at some some hospital on the west coast. But anyway, so one of the issues we had was the FDA. Everybody thought the FDA would throw up on our technology, but we actually went and we got really good FDA results and feedback, and so we're moving forward. And even I would put that in the deck because it was like the number 1 thing was everyone's criticism. So I think you got to take the criticisms and turn the bug into a feature. Like, take the criticism and put it out there as like a marketing statement of like, I know what you're thinking, but it's what I thought. But so that's what I would do is I would put why you did it, why it's such a big problem, why it's been so hard for everybody else, why you think this approach will work, and the 3 or 4 things that scared you, but you actually think they're not as big a problem as people think. All the other particulars, I think, are kind of come out of the conversation, and it's you want to create a story for conversation, basically. The other thing I always want to know is if you're bringing more than one person into a room is how did you all, it's all about cognitive, there's cognitive dissonance and then there's cognitive, I guess, consonance or whatever that would be. But, and so, you want to tell, the story's got to hang well together. We work together, this is my neighbor, he heard what I was working on. He used to be in the business world, now he's kind of helped me. Whatever it is, the story of how you all came together is important.
Great. Well, I think that's our time for this particular panel. But thank you. I really appreciate your comments. And while we're getting set up for the next panel, I think you're going to be hanging around for the reception as well if people have more questions.
That's great. Thank you again. Thanks, Amir. Thanks, Roger. So now we're going to shift to game conditions. But before we do this, just a word from our sponsor, which is Madeline Halley, who's standing right there, is going to send all of you a survey, and we are looking for some feedback. So please, if you get a chance, just a few questions. We'd love to get that back from you. So Meredith Fisher, as I mentioned, a partner in the PIF and the Partners Innovation Fund, is going to moderate this next panel. It's really a very well constructed, very balanced representation of what happens in the entrepreneurial community. No surprise, she came to us previously having worked at PureTech and Bracebridge, both investment and company creation-oriented entities. Her PhDs from Harvard, her MBAs from the Sloan School at MIT. From my standpoint, looking at this, the panel there are getting ready to be seated. It's just ideal in the sense you have clinician, investigator, inventor, entrepreneur, investor, executive, and the glue factor, as Amir said. So I'll turn it over to Meredith, who's going to guide us through this next discussion.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, everybody, for turning out. You guys just please come sit down. I think there was a slide that they had. Yeah, we'll see if we adhere to that. And Roger, you're going to sub in. So Christine Brennan, who's a partner at Merck Research Lab Venture Fund, had a last-minute conflict, so wasn't able to join us tonight. So I've asked Roger Kitterman to stand in for that. But what I'm most excited about actually this evening is, as Chris alluded to, the actual grouping that we have here to represent many important and different perspectives from the realm of venture capital. And as you said, wherever he is. As he said, we have someone who has acted as an executive and founder of the company, 2 folks who are on the investment side, and then I think also almost in some ways, particularly to this audience, most importantly, 2 people who have actually been scientific founders of companies and have had various experiences there. And so what I'd really like to use the time to do is actually pick up on a lot of the elements that Amir and Roger touched on, but really to go both a little bit deeper because we have a little more time, but also importantly to give a couple different types of perspectives from some of those different angles as that may actually inform it. And so what I'll do is go through and ask people specific questions. And then again, at the end, I do want to make sure that we have time available to ask questions. And I would encourage you in particular, frankly, as those of you who are thinking about being entrepreneurs, is that, asking the questions of the operators and of the founders is really important. You obviously have access to us as investors, but, an opportunity to actually ask people who have been there and done that on the side of the table that you may be thinking about being on is really incredible. And so thank you guys for your attention, and also thanks to the panelists. So let me go through actually in a little more detail and introduce them. To my immediate left is Barbara Fox. Barbara is currently the CEO of Telos, and actually the first and former Partners Innovation Fund entrepreneur in residence. So she came to us with after a great career, actually both being on the academic side, on the scientific side, on the founding side, and then at the executive level. And Telos itself is actually formed on the basis of work coming out of Howard Weiner's lab at the Brigham. And, they're working, I would say, largely in the immuno-oncology space, but I think in particularly interesting in being able to actually think about ways that you can actually transform that tumor microenvironment to help treat cancers. Next down is Roger Kitterman. I'll be short on him. He's managing director of the fund. You heard from him previously. And then go on to Darshana Zaveri. She is a partner at Health Catalyst Ventures. Health Catalyst Venture is really unique, and I think Darshana will bring a lot of interesting input today because they're a fund that's particularly focused on medical devices and technologies and at the earliest stages. So a very important and critical point of time in the venture community, as the last chat indicated. And then, yes, okay, great. So the next is Dr. Steve Greenberg. He's a neurologist at Brigham, and his research is actually the foundational technology for a company in PIF's portfolio. It's called AbCuro, and they're really developing the next generation of T-cell targeted technologies. And so Steve has had a great experience in recently coming up with an idea that then was actually translated into a venture investment. And then finally, last but certainly not least, is Doug Rains. Doug is an anesthesiologist at the Mass General, and his research was actually the foundational technology for a company that was also a PIF portfolio company called Anovation. And Anovation developed a novel anesthetic, which was actually purchased by the medicines company in 2015. So Doug represents a view towards venture capital of someone who has been a scientific founder, who's actually seen that work translated, and then watched really sort of the entire lifetime of a company all the way through to that, that rare and most desirable exit. So again, terrific to have him, and look forward to turning this over to you. So the first thing that I actually do want to talk about, and I'll ask Doug and Steve to first comment on this, is actually the founder's role, because my hope is that most of the people in the audience tonight are interested in being a founder, have an idea for a company, or may even have a company or be working on that. And so I think that that's a very unique role and a very interesting one to have. And so I'd be curious to hear from both of you, how did you think about the founder's role? How did you get interested in that? And I think also importantly, how did that change over time as you went from having the idea to actually going all the way through to a company? And either one of you can start.
Sure. Well, I guess I never really thought about being a founder. I just had an idea and I wanted to see it translate. I had some previous experience with drug development through a sort of hybrid program with Pfizer, their Center for Therapeutic Innovation, which was a program which contracted with early stage ideas from academics, and created a new drug. So I had a target and I had a set of an approach to translating that target to the clinic, but I got to watch somebody else run the show and learn a lot about all the stages of drug discovery. So when I had another set of ideas that I wanted to translate, I kind of thought I had learned enough to be able to do that on my own, sort of. But I had help, and I approached PIF and Roger first, and then Jay, and they sort of helped me, and I grabbed the project manager from Pfizer, who I'd worked with for several years, and got him out there, and we created a company together. So that was the beginning of the company, and I guess I never really treated it in any other way than an academic project in many ways. I've put all my effort into trying to make the idea the best possible scientific idea, not to worry so much about its commercialization, but to get every step right scientifically and hope that it will turn out for the best.
So I'd say, unlike Steve, I had no experience in drug development or company formation. I was and am a PI in an NIH-funded lab that was devoted to defining molecular mechanisms of anesthetic action. And as we always say in our grants, when we understand how these drugs work, we'll make better ones. And of course, even the newest anesthetics that we use today were created about 30 years ago. So we figured that maybe we had some ideas that we might be able to employ to create some new anesthetic drugs. And we had some preliminary data, and we presented that to the licensing group, and the licensing group reached out to probably about a half a dozen companies out there that were in the anesthesia world. And the response was pretty much the same. Neat idea, come back when you've got some human data. And part of that is I think that the anesthesia market is relatively small, and there was certainly some sensitivity to taking on a project at a very early stage. So I spoke with the folks at Partners Innovation Fund, met with Roger and with Carl Burke, and we started talking about putting together a company. in terms of the amount of time that took, and whenever I talk to people about starting a company, they say, I don't have time. There's some time that it takes up front. There are a number of steps you have to work through in terms of coming up with at least a vision for your company and defining some strategic plans for reaching a value inflection point. Putting together a team, which for me was just basically bringing in a CEO and interfacing with the licensing group, because you don't own the technology, the hospital does, and making an arrangement so that the startup company could license the technology, and then ultimately finding funding. It was, so I would say probably in the first year, it took maybe 10% of my time. It wasn't a big sink.
And Barbara, I'm going to ask you to comment on this as well, since you have been on the academic side. You've also been a founder and really have now, instead of staying there, have come over and been a CEO. What is your approach, or what are the ways that you might be able to describe the shifting role or the experience as a founder, but as someone who's transitioned over to the executive side as well?
Yeah, mine was a little bit different because the company I started was the company, well, because I didn't actually found a company based on my own academic science, so it's a little bit different. But I think that the role of the founder, as I've seen it in various companies, does definitely shift over time. So at the beginning, it's all your idea. You have helped create this company. There's an enormous amount of ownership. And then if you're planning to stay on the academic side, that does shift over time, as it should. One, you're either putting 10% of your time in, or even if you want to put in more than that, there's a different set of skills that are required in drug development. There's the business side that Amir talked about. There's a certain amount of, you can either view it as relinquishment of ownership, or a better way to think of it as increasing the ownership so that people with very different expertise can come in and add value to what was your original idea. But you do have to kind of keep that open mind that there is a universe of stuff out there that you don't know, and that if you don't bring in people who do know it, you will not be successful. So you have to view it as a learning opportunity, I think, probably.
Great. And does anyone else have any comments on that? Okay, great. So the next thing that I actually want to talk about, although this panel was titled VC, is that sort of the term venture capital actually in some ways describes a number of different types of investments, but largely driven around the fact that people will invest and buy equity into a company. And that actually comprises a number of different types. So we're talking about venture. We can actually think about angels. We can talk about different types of venture. And I think also even into granting agencies who are starting to dabble in this. And for instance, in my experience, actually working out of a private office where it was really a fund that was not actually uniquely sped up to invest in healthcare, but decided to sort of put that into their practice. And so what I'd like to ask Roger and Darshana, either one of you to take the lead on this, is to maybe go a little bit deeper into what does that mean? What is an institutional VC? What is a strategic VC? What does an angel group look like? Because there are a lot of different sources of capital out there that could fall under the term venture. So either one of you that want to take that up.
Sure, I'll take that. And I think, Meredith, you did a great job just outlining sort of what are all the different pools of capital that entrepreneurs can go to these days for financing. And in fact, I would say that pool is increasing by the day. There's a lot of, there was a time when institutional venture capital was really the only source of capital that entrepreneurs could resort to. But nowadays, there's all kinds of other pools of capital. So angels is one. I think that's in Boston. There is a very, very thriving angel community. And so by angels, I mean wealthy individuals or groups of wealthy individuals that will pool their money together and invest in an idea. Typically, that's when you, as an entrepreneur, you would approach that group when you have sort of limited capital needs. My experience is angels or angel groups tend to invest less than $5 million or so, in the $2 or $3 million range per round, or even smaller. but you can do a lot with a little bit of money. So I think that's a very valuable resource for entrepreneurs to turn to. Sometimes, on occasion, I've seen family offices that will write really big checks, and so these are sort of individual, wealthy families that are either run by a family member or are run by a professional organization that often they have certain areas that they like. For example, there are families that have had a lot of cardiac issues or have had a lot of cancer, and they like to invest in those areas. So that's another sort of very important pool of capital especially for startups. Next stage, I would say, is sort of the micro VC, and that's, you hear that name thrown around a lot these days, but it's especially relevant for sort of technology type investments or healthcare IT. So where the overall capital requirements of the company are going to be not super huge, not like a pharma or a drug company. There are several sort of venture capital funds that are small-sized funds, $30 to $50 million, that tend to write, smaller checks, $2 or $3 million checks. And that's, there's many of those funds out there. They're hard to find, but if you look hard enough and do some research, they're out there. The institutional venture capital funds are sort of the funds that are backed by big institutions, so like pension funds and government agencies and corporates. So those are bigger funds. Polaris is obviously one of those big institutional VCs. Big money, write big checks, and tend to fund, I think, companies that overall are going to require significant capital over their lifetime. And then I think another very important source these days is corporate VCs. So a lot of companies are directly coming into deals, even at the very early stage. This used to be true of pharma, but we invest in devices, and we've started seeing a lot of activity by device companies like Medtronic. Medtronic has always been very active, but recently Boston Scientific has become very active, and we also have Edwards and Varian and other device companies in some of our deals. And they will come in early stage. They don't want to miss out on a company when it gets to be too big and have too much money in it already. So they will come in and write small checks and join a syndicate or even sometimes lead on their own. So I don't know if I missed anything there, Roger, but.
No, that sounds good. And the other thing I would add is that on the corporate side, so imagine if it's a pharma company investor, that's been a major change over the last 10 years. If you look 10 to 15 years ago, there were a few. Now it's almost every major pharma company has a venture capital arm. But when you're talking to them, you need to be careful to think about what their model is. Because some invest because they want to see the company succeed and maybe buy it later on, and that's all they care about. Whereas others, it really needs to be strategically tied to what the company wants to do and may ask for some rights of acquisition or those kinds of things. Some do and some don't. And again, it's a matter of knowing who you're talking to and what their motivations are.
Terrific. So thank you guys for that. So I actually want to pick up on one of the topics that Roger and Amir were talking about, which is team and CEO and sort of how to actually put some meat around the bones of your technology when you're thinking about operators. And I'm going to start with Barbara and say, as a CEO, what are you looking for when it comes to science, when it comes to founders, when it comes to an opportunity that you would want to come in and lead? Because oftentimes, CEOs can be looked at as guns for hire, but I think are also can make, or as we know well, can make or break a company. And that marriage piece or that match piece that Amir alluded to is important for us on the investment side, but also very, very important for you as an executive. And so I'd be curious for you to comment on that.
Sure, I'd be happy to, but can I chime in on the financing
Oh, please do.
side
Yes,
first?
of course. Yes, please.
Money is not all the same, and you can make decisions early on that will ruin your opportunity to ever get your your technology advance. Just as Amir mentioned, if you bring in the wrong CEO, they're going to look at it and go like, just politely say no because it's too much trouble. If you raise, you can think, wow, if only I could bring in a couple $1 million in angel funding and kind of get this into people, everybody would kind of break down my door. And sometimes that's just the wrong thing to do. You can bring in the wrong people. You can make your cap table too crowded. You can just make it much, much harder. So take advantage of PIF to run that idea by them and say, does this initial source of capital consistent with what I'm going to need to actually build this company out? Because you can ruin a good idea. Anyway, so that was an aside.
Please continue to chime in.
Spoken from hard knocks on that one. So on the team side, so as Meredith said, I came in as the first entrepreneur in residence for PIF, and that's just it's like the coolest job ever. They kind of pay you to wander around the hospitals talking to really smart people and seeing if it's something that you want to take on and work with the partners at PIF for things that have kind of moved along. And so you're looking for something that you think you can add value to, a founder you think you can work with. So for me, it is integrity, quality of the science, something which looks interesting enough I can really sink my teeth into. You're looking for, so that's kind of on the founder side, chemistry, integrity, and good science, and a real opportunity, and just a kind of scientific fit. And then in pulling the team together, most CEOs are kind of operating early stage execs you're running off of your network of all the people you've worked with before who have, on the legal side or on the finance side or on business development if you need it early on, or who is good in toxicology, who's good in, identifying a CRO who can help validate the technology early on. So you are really building on that network of previous contacts and universes to kind of get a company going from nothing, or you don't consider it nothing, from like a scientific founding in a lab to a company, which is a big transition. So that team, a lot of it is comfort with teams, people you've worked with before, people that you have known in previous positions.
Great. And then I'm going to ask everybody to comment, but Steve and Doug, I'd like to also have you comment. And Steve, I'll call you out first, which is to say, in some ways you kind of glossed over the fact that you were able to bring someone from a large pharma organization to leave that post to get excited enough about your science to actually come in and want to lead a small early stage, high risk company, which is a very big leap for people in industry to make. So, maybe you're going to tell us that just happened by magic, or what I'd really be interested to see is how did that evolve over time? How was your thinking about that? Because, for our perspective, you delivered a team that we thought could also be an investable one, which is frankly oftentimes an outlier for us when we're working with a new entrepreneur. So be curious to hear about that.
Sure. Well, I guess my strengths were around identifying a target and its uses, but not making drugs, although I knew roughly about the process. And my co-founder is an antibody engineer who spent 10 years at Pfizer making drugs, bringing them to IND. So we had exactly a great complementary set of skills over this, and I think he saw that and recognized it. And was interested in taking a chance himself. So I think it just worked out. He certainly believed in the idea as much as I do. So I think it wasn't that hard to actually get him to jump ship and jump into this program.
Yes, I'll push you a little bit more.
Okay.
I'll push you a little bit more there to say that there was also, as a co-founder, sort of the brass tacks of you are the scientist, he is the operator, and you actually had to figure out how that ownership, how that was going to look from sort of a founding perspective. How did you have those conversations? Were they easy? Were they hard? And what advice would you give to people who are thinking about recruiting, a CEO and actually bringing that to bear to the company before you went out to get venture?
I think early on we had very frank discussions about what we each wanted and expected, and we talked about it and agreed right away in terms of what we, how we wanted to split up the company. We went ahead and filed and incorporated the company on our own. We even, before we raised seed money, we put a little bit of money of our own into this. We rented lab space with the expectation that we were going to be able to get the seed funding, which we did. So that aspect wasn't very difficult. It just worked. We were friends as well. We had worked together for 5 years.
So back to Barbara's point, the trust issue was the trust was there, the knowledge was there. So Doug, your experience was a little bit different with Anovation, and so could you talk a little bit about your view of that in the team formation?
Sure. It was very different. So probably the first member of the team was Carl Burke of the Partners Innovation Fund. And I think that it's important for everybody to recognize that venture capitalists, whether partners or external VCs, they offer money, but it's much more than money. They offer expertise, they offer networking. So there are lots of things that they offer even besides the cash that they may invest in your company. So he was the first person. Then once he was part of the team, I sort of got access to PIF's Rolodex to identify a CEO entrepreneur who could sort of help me take this to the next step. I mean, I had a day job. I was still running a lab, still doing clinical work. My wife told me I couldn't quit my job. So I sort of had to keep going, and I think she probably locked up the checkbook as well. Identified someone with both experience and actually scientific skills that we could leverage in the company. And so I offered him equity in the company in exchange for taking on the role of CEO. Next part of the team was basically finding attorneys because we needed to incorporate the company, distribute company stock. And again, we sort of did it fairly inexpensively because now this was the end of 2009. So in the midst of the Great Recession, it seemed as though there were a lot more lawyers than legal work. So the attorneys were willing to take on this startup company and do all the legal work on a contingency basis. So the contingency was we would get funding of a certain value, and it was on the order of about $400,000 or $500,000. And if we achieved that, we would get paid. So that was sort of the initial team of people. And once we had put all that together, we were sort of ready to do things like we got an option for the license from partners from the hospital, and then we could start making visits to venture capital groups as well as angel investors. And we went to 2 angel investor groups. Mass Medical Angels was one of them. We had about a half a dozen Mass Medical Angels invest in this initial seed round and the subsequent Series A round. And we probably talked to about 10 VC groups, and we're ultimately got funding from Atlas Venture.
Great. So Roger and Darshana, instead of putting you guys specifically on the spot for a question, what I'd like you to do is just comment on team, comment on CEO, whatever additional advice or thoughts you might have in that direction.
Sure. Team is obviously critical. And what I would say is that it's most critical at the very beginning when you don't really have a team. And so make sure that the team that you're surrounding yourself with, whether it's a CEO, as we've discussed before, or also the people who are advising you, who you're going back to say, does this sound right to you? Make sure that they're A's. The science coming out of these institutions is A. And make sure that the level of business advisors that you're talking to are at the level of your science. Because when we see things fail, outside of the technology, outside of the idea, but they fail because of the process, it really comes from 2 areas most commonly. One is hire the wrong CEO, get bad advice from there, and it just doesn't move forward. The other one is, a founder says, okay, I've got these advisors, and they're telling me that I should be doing this, this, and this. And if that's the wrong advice, we see deals die because of that. It's like, oh, it's over asking on what the valuation of the company should be and just digging in your heels and letting a term sheet die from that perspective. So make sure that the people that you are surrounding yourself with who are giving you advice actually know what they're talking about and have experience in this field. We had one company die because the person kept saying, well, my lawyer says this and that's wrong. And eventually I said, so who is your lawyer? Oh, well, this big firm. Yeah, that's a good firm. What do they work on? Real estate. It's like, okay, probably not the right person to be advising you through this process. And at the end of the day, the company never got launched, in part because the person got bad advice.
Yeah, I think everybody's comments are right on this, right on. The only thing I'll add is, people always say that a B grade idea, and an A grade team can be a really successful company, whereas it doesn't work the other way around. And I think there's some truth to that. My personal belief is that an A-grade team is only attracted to an A-grade technology or idea. So you really need both. And it's really hard to define what that A-grade team looks like. And I can, share some examples. We have one CEO, one founder of a portfolio company who I met when she was 22 years old and didn't have, any major pedigree or experience, just a brilliant idea. And was able to make a very successful company. She took 2 products through FDA clearance and completed a very successful clinical trial. So, she's not the definition of an ideal CEO, but she just was amazing. On the other end of the spectrum, we have, a CEO who has decades of experience. He's in his 60s and came out of retirement to start a company. But his eyes light up when he talks about his technology, and he actually is like a little kid. And it's just fantastic. And I think the underlying factor there is passion. It's really the passion to start a company, passion about the idea, passion about the technology, passion to make it work, because you are going to get hit with a lot of problems through the life cycle of the company, and you really have to have the grit to see it through. And that comes because you really want to make that idea work. So I think if you are the founder, the scientific founder, and you're looking for a team member, look for that passion, look for someone that actually believes in what you're doing and is willing to go out and do what it takes to make it successful. I think that's it.
Great. Anyone else have any other comments on that? No? Okay. So Darshana, I'm going to put the spotlight back on you. I'm going to pick up on the last topic that Roger and Amir talked about, which is the medical device field. Because while we tried to get a strong representation, admittedly it was much easier to deliver panelists who were heavily weighted towards therapeutics, and that's really reflected in some of the challenges that Amir brought up. And you are a medical device investor, and not only that, but an early stage medical device investor, so a unicorn in this.
Did you mean foolish?
Exactly, a unicorn currently. So, what hope can you provide to people? What is it like out there on your side of the table and thinking about investing in companies, seeing companies, taking them through exit? Can you lift the spirits of people in the room? Can you dampen them? What can you give to the folks here thinking about that who may have ideas?
That's a great question. I just heard recently somebody did a survey on medtech investors left in the U.S., and they told me there were 6. I don't believe that number. I think we've done deals with more than 6 medtech investors, so I don't think that's quite true. And they might have been speaking of pure play medtech investors, which is what we are. We only invest in medical devices and some diagnostics, but really very, very tech heavy type investments. So what we call engineering solutions for medical problems. And we've been doing that for the last 12 years. We did it when it was fashionable, and we did it when it was unfashionable, and now people are starting to talk about medtech again, and we're still doing it. We've had some success, and so we've been able to raise 3 funds. The issue is that I think it takes a long time to deliver a good exit, so liquidity to your investors. That's one problem. The second problem is there are no billion-dollar exits in medtech. It's very rare. I think NeoTract probably maybe the first in 10 years or. Probably not, but it's just you can count on one hand how many billion-dollar exits there are. So, by and large, an exit in med tech is around, the average is between 150 and 200 million. So, if you're going to invest $40, $50, $60 million into the company and make 100, 150, 200, well, the math doesn't work. It just doesn't work. You don't make enough money. You don't have enough investors that are investing in long life cycle products that make very little money. So from our perspective, what we have figured out, and I don't know if you want to call this sort of any glimpse of any positive news, but what we have learned over time is to invest in a very, very capital efficient manner. And by that I mean less than $20 million through the life cycle of a med tech company. There are some exceptions to that, which I can talk about, but by and large, our investments are less than 20 million raised by the company through the life of the company. And then when you have a $150, $200 million exit, now the math makes sense. So I'd say to begin with, in med tech, it is extremely important to be very, very capital efficient. Number two, the value proposition of the technology needs to be crystal clear. And, we see, 500 deals a year, and we do one or two. So the majority of the companies that come to us are trying to solve a problem that doesn't really exist. And it's very, very important to be sure that what you're doing is super, super critical and really is addressing a big unmet need. That's true for everything, but it's particularly true for medical devices. And the third, I think, is, there are some, luckily, I think for the med tech sector, there are some problems that can only be solved with devices. I mean, you can't, fix a hole in the heart with a drug. It doesn't work. So you need devices for certain problems. And so our investment thesis is creating mechanical solutions for mechanical problems, and big ones at that.
Yeah, terrific. So thanks. So Roger, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot. As all of you should know, WMIF this year is focused on artificial intelligence, and there's really been a rising or emerging view of that and the importance of it in healthcare and where that's going to go. And of course, that starts to trickle all the way through to the venture funds as well, and what we should be funding and how we should be thinking about this. And so, as someone who's managing director of a fund that in principle invests broadly across all areas, how do you think that PIF and how do you think that we should be thinking about, let's call it healthcare IT, or more broadly about that? Because I think, we kind of know where we are with therapeutics. We just heard from Darshana where we are about med tech. Be curious to get your thoughts there.
Sure. And if you look at healthcare IT investing maybe 10 years ago versus today, there's dramatically more investment in healthcare IT. And AI is a huge buzzword right now, and growing rapidly. Some of that is buzzwords, and some of that's really real. And it's the kind of thing that is starting to infect, whole areas of industry beyond just the idea of a pure play AI kind of situation. So when you look at healthcare IT from our perspective, we're the Partners Innovation Fund, which means we invest in partners' technologies. So we invest in things that were invented here at one of our hospitals. Almost by definition, that means we're probably investing in solutions that help providers. So if something's a good deal, it's a good technology to help Mass General solve a problem, help the Brigham solve a problem, then we'll say, hey, that might be a company. We can spin that out into a company. And we've done that on a few occasions. And brought that to sell to other hospitals and move it forward. One of the things we found with those technologies is we really need to see those technologies adopted throughout the hospitals. If somebody comes to us and says, I can't get anybody at MGH to fund this or to pay any money for my service, can you fund me? It's like, well, if nobody's willing to pay for this, maybe the value is not there. So as we look at our fund, we tend to focus on things that are provider focused. That's probably a smaller percentage of what's going on in healthcare IT. Generally, a lot of the money that's been invested in healthcare IT is consumer focused. And we see a little bit of that, but by and large, for us, it's just a smaller part of the deal flow that we see. But I would say that healthcare IT as a general category is growing very quickly.
Anyone else want to comment? No, Steve, not your area of right. Okay. So as we're coming to a close, I want to have one last question that I want to ask everybody here. But Barbara, I'm going to start with you. One of the things that we see as a fund that sits within the academic setting, but actually is looking at companies that are translating academic research over to industry, is that there's a real disconnect because fundamentally those two institutions are set up to ask different questions and have different goals, and that's great, but it can also cause some tension. And so, Barbara, what I'd be very interested to hear is your thoughts on, as someone who has recently brought something out of academia and has moved that into industry, what does that look like? How do you think about that? What are the risks? What are the things that you look to do, with the technology, with the data, and what are the aims that you have that may differ in the industry setting than the academic setting? And what guidance would you give for people in thinking about that transition?
That's a big question. So that's okay. So I think you really are asking completely different questions generally, unless you are a really applied translational scientist. So you're most academic scientists, you're trying to understand how something can work. I think that's sort of and you're setting up experimental systems to show that a mechanism can be operative. And so you'll set up an animal model to test something, and you'll show that a particular mechanism is viable, and it's interesting because it's different than every other mechanism that's out there and is publishable, and you make a big splash. And then if you put that in industry, there's sort of two things that are fundamentally different. One, just because it's interesting and new doesn't mean it addresses an unmet medical need. So I've talked to many academic investigators who you'll say, I think this problem has already been solved. And the answer you get back is, but it's a different mechanism. And the world doesn't care if it's a different mechanism if the problem has already been solved. So that's kind of number one. And then the other is, and I'm sure everybody has read the thing about 50% of things coming out of academic labs can't be reproduced in an industry setting. And to me, that reflects the fact that different questions are being asked. So generally, I think the alternatives are rare, that you're asking, again, whether something can work. And when you move it into industry, you have to ask, is it robust enough that it will work? That if you put it in the hands of somebody who doesn't love it, who hasn't tweaked the system so it's exactly right and has just the right buffers and, really doesn't care about the result, is it still going to work? And that's a fundamentally different question. I think that's where a lot of the disconnect in that translation occurs and causes some hurt feelings sometimes.
And so, Steve and Doug, I'm going to ask you to pick it up a little bit, but actually to talk a little bit about the data side, which is to say, if you're preparing to go out to get venture, where were you in your data package? How much translational data was in there, and what would you either do differently, or where do you think people need to be to actually be able to be successful in approaching venture? And I'd be curious to hear from both of you on that.
Well, I do happen to be an applied translational scientist, as Barbara mentioned. And so my focus has always been on human disease and translating and understanding the steps of what would it take to tie target to a primary outcome measure that's been used in a clinical trial, for example. So I've always been focused on data that's addressing getting a new target, making a new drug for a target into the clinic. I don't do animal models at all. And so this particular idea that launched this company, I think Piff knows this, Roger knows this, but basically they funded a literature search over a new target that no one had done drug development around in a very crowded space of checkpoint inhibitors, but a target that seemed overlooked to us. And so they did take a risk, and a lot of the activities of the company have been merged. The drug development has been merged with the science in the area as well. I didn't spend 5 years in the lab publishing exciting mechanism work and working on the animal model and publishing that. If I had done that, then the opportunity wouldn't have been there to work on this particular target. So in many ways, what I do now is exactly what I was doing beforehand. I spend 100% of my time on this, even though I'm only allowed to spend 20% under Harvard rules. So don't tell anybody on that.
Yeah. So my lab was very different from Steve's. So we were extremely mechanistic. Our idea of translational research was translating a finding from a receptor to a single cell. And so we really made a big sort of translational step when we actually started testing some of our compounds, our new compounds in animals. So we came in at obviously a very much earlier stage. And when we first, in fact, approached PIF about funding, they said, come back when you have more data. So there was sort of a year gap where we then came back, we had even more animal data. But admittedly, it was always quite early. And I have to say that both PIF and Atlas Venture agreed to come in at a fairly early stage relative to the development. And some of it has to do with the fact that the development pathway looked like it was going to be very straightforward and fast and relatively inexpensive. So it wasn't a project that was going to take many tens of millions of dollars. In fact, the whole thing was done with about $10 million worth of funding. So I think that was a particular advantage that we had, that this was going to had the potential to be very fast and very inexpensive. So we came pretty early, and we were sort of forced to in a way because we had already approached drug companies and they had told us what they wanted, and we weren't going to get there very quickly unless we had external funding.
Yeah, great. So Roger and Darshan, do you guys have any comments on that from your side?
No, I mean, I would just add that with both of these companies, we had an initial meeting and said this is really interesting, but we need to have some more conversations. There needs to be some more work done. But we sort of collaboratively talked about what that might be, and in both cases, a lot of entrepreneurial effort on the part of the PIs really brought it forward to the stage where then it can become a company.
Yeah, and I think that's a great thing to emphasize. So I want to make sure we have times for questions. So at this point, I'll pause and open it up to the audience. So a question up front here. Yep, please. Yeah. Right. I think we're out of mics. Right.
Thank you. Alex Sherman, Neurology here at Mass General. So great panel, but usually when I listen to such panels, it's all success. So basically, as we know, majority of startups do not succeed, right? I mean, personally, I've been through many startups and probably 30% success rate. And the failure rate was based either on, in 6 months, founders stopped talking to each other, or VCs didn't develop the next tranche because they lost money elsewhere, and so on. So I was wondering, probably a question to Steve and Doug, and Steve, actually, you're known here at Neurology as the other Steve Greenberg. So what are the near misses, if you wish, that you can see that maybe it could turn, from success to complete failure? So can you talk and share with us such experiences, if they were?
So I can tell you that in our company, we certainly had an early stage near-death experience. And the feedback that I got from Carl at PIP was all successful companies have 3 near-death experiences. So our near-death experience came after the seed round, where we had 2 lead compounds that we thought would make it into clinical trials, and the pharmacology wasn't quite right. And so what we wound up doing is, and just so coincidentally, NIH had funded us by that point to do drug development. So we were actually developing technology in our laboratory while Innovation was trying to develop these drugs. And so ultimately what wound up happening, we patented new technology in our lab, licensed that to Innovation. Innovation took that, and that ultimately was the technology that was acquired, probably at that point about 2 or 3 years later by the medicines company. So I think perseverance is important. There are lots of ups and downs, and even when you talk to venture capitalists, adaptability, and you may find another use for the IP that you have. So continuing to push forward and not losing hope, and that comes true even when you're talking to venture capitalists, because a lot of them will tell you that your child is ugly, even though you think it's the most brilliant child in the world.
So I can talk about not near death, but death experiences quite happily. So Telos, I don't know. We have a near death experience on a daily basis. I feel like we're working at immuno-oncology, and half the time I'm going like, what are we doing? Is there really a need for yet another molecule? And then 15 minutes later, I think this is the most exciting science I've ever worked in my life, and I'm sure this is going to be a completely foundational asset. So, you kind of have that sort of daily flip. But my last company, so this is my third company. My first company, we were developing medications to treat addiction. We were just way in front of the market. This was a long time ago. There was no market there. Nobody would invest in it. Nobody could make money in it. Huge learning curve on that one. And then my last company, we were funded almost entirely by angels. I raised $25 million from angels for a therapeutics company. And there were all sorts of other team issues and technology issues and everything else. But that mismatch between our capitalization strategy and what the company needed to do ultimately was the thing, in my opinion, the primary thing that killed us. That kind of going down a financing path where you cannot actually map out except by luck. So if everything went perfectly, it would have been great. But that's just not the way the world works. You're going to hit bumps in the road, and you need enough capital around the table so that if things look terrible, fine, you're going to kill it. But if things look good, but need a little bit of extra love, that there is enough money around that can happen. And to not, especially in therapeutics, to not appreciate that at the beginning, you can just not get to a point where you can't overcome it. So, and it's painful, for sure. You learn a lot.
So we have another question. Michaela?
Thank you all for coming here and sharing your knowledge and experience. I'm Michaela Levin. I'm a licensing manager at Partners Innovation. I have a question to you, Barbara, especially what you just said. I thought was very interesting. But to all panelists, in your experience, what is the major reason? I give you two options here. If you see something fail and the science wasn't great, but it wasn't the science that failed, is it the discipline of the team to move forward and go past emotional or grievances? Or is there really most of the time that, and I'm talking again, not about complete failure of science, is there most of the time an issue that couldn't be foreseen, a financial issue? So what are the top reasons if the science is not a complete failure?
So when Avaxia, my last company, was failing, I'm a scientist, and to me, the only acceptable reason for a company to fail was because the science didn't work. And anything beyond that was just a personal failure. And I was talking to my youngest daughter about it, who was just like, Mom, it's because you're a scientist. There are so many reasons. Companies fail all the time that are not science-based companies. Yeah, it can be the team. It can be that for us, the other issue is the market had shifted over the 10 years we were building the drug. A really good drug came out in the field that shifted kind of where that goalpost needed to be. And we were probably not going to have enough efficacy. There was going to be hard to recruit patients, et cetera, et cetera. So there can be that. It can be totally external forces. Another drug comes along, another drug failed in your space. And so the whole confidence in that technology goes down the tubes, and you have no control over it. You happen to be working in, or you're working in cardiovascular, and like nobody's funded anything in cardiovascular for a decade because the clinical trials were too long. I mean, there's so many things that are out of your control, which is why you need a lot of experience and a lot of capital around the table.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There are so many different reasons for failure. To me, though, at this early stage, particularly in our space, it's usually because there is it has a lot to do with team. And sometimes to do with product market fit, which means that your that your product doesn't really solve the problem that's out there. There isn't the right fit. And then that goes back again to the teams, that how come the team didn't realize at the beginning or even through the process that this isn't going to work. I think it all comes back to the team at some point.
I think that brings us to 7 o'clock. So I want to thank everybody on the panel as well as also for the audience for their attention. And I think Chris just has a couple quick closing remarks.
Yeah, I just want to join Meredith in thanking our outstanding thoughtful and heartfelt remarks from Doug, Steve, Deshauna, Roger, Barbara, and of course our expert moderator, Meredith. I think they deserve one more round of applause. And I'd just like to again thank our entire team who's here, including the 2 of them who asked questions tonight. We're grateful for that. And then on the PIF side, Robert Millman and Stacy Brenner, both supporting our investment function. Madeline Halley is going to send all of you a survey tomorrow. If you have a chance to fill it out, we would be grateful. And then Meredith was nice enough to mention the World Medical Innovation Forum. I see at least one steering committee member here today. April 23rd to the 25th. It is going to sell out, absolutely. So if you're thinking about coming, please come. If you're an early career person and registration's an issue, speak to your chair or speak to us. We'll work it out. We'd love to have you there. The focus is artificial intelligence, and we have an investment panel there. And some of these same topics will be talked about in the context of artificial intelligence. So thanks, everyone. There's a reception afterwards, and we appreciate you coming. Thank you, guys.